Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about how to better cover the way companies behave. Joined today by a great group of journalists and our Violation Tracker Project Director. We've got Nadine Savai here. She's an award-winning reporter whose work has appeared on the public radio and PBS Frontline. She'll be talking today about underage and unprotected, a investigation she did into a seafood processing plant and other things as well. Also joined here today by Jason Garcia, who writes Seeking Rents and was with the Orlando Sentinel. He's written a lot on Florida and how companies uh, intersect with power there. He's also the author of Big Profits, Tiny Taxes, which explored how companies dodge Florida taxes and what policymakers could do about it. And David Armiak is with the Center for Media and Democracy. He's the research director there. And he has done investigations into all kinds of things, dark money, right-wing networks, and he also does hundreds of FOIA requests a year. So ask him about public records. Also joined here by my colleague Phil Mattera. He's a longtime former journalist and was the research director for Good Jobs First, and is now does our violation tracker database. He's the project lead on that. Phil, do you want to start our presentation? Thanks, and we can jump to the next slide. So I'm with Good Jobs First. We're a national nonprofit that promotes corporate and government accountability and economic development. We've done a lot trying to push more transparency around the use of economic development incentives. And we also do a lot into revealing corporate misconduct through our databases, which we'll get into in a minute. Next slide. Good Jobs First has 6 different databases. Today we're going to focus on Violation Tracker and Violation Tracker Global. But Subsidy Tracker and Tax Break Tracker are 2 databases that focus on ways that companies get money through economic development incentives. We actually had a webinar on that topic a few weeks ago. Happy to send a recording to anyone who's interested in that. And we also have Violation Tracker Global, and Violation Tracker UK, all of which track corporate misconduct. And Phil, who I'll turn it over to now, will talk about some ways to make the best use of those databases.
Okay, thanks, Arlene. So Violation Tracker is the most comprehensive database available on corporate crime and misconduct. It's free to use in terms of searching and displaying search results, although we do ask you to pay something if you want to download the search results into spreadsheet form. So it's got over 500,000 federal entries, 150,000 state and local, 5,000 class actions, and altogether we document over $1 trillion in penalties going back to 2000. At the federal level, we cover all the divisions of the Justice Department, both civil and criminal cases, but not cases against individuals. These are all cases against corporations, nonprofits, and other entities like that, but not people. We've got all the non-prosecution agreements, the deferred prosecution agreements, the declinations, all these different kinds of leniency agreements that are getting more and more use by DOJ. We cover basically every federal regulatory agency that deals with business, ranging from the big ones like the SEC to, lesser known ones like the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. At the state level, we've got cases from all the state AGs, including all the multi-state cases where the different AGs get together, sometimes kind of divided by ideological preferences. Sometimes they actually intersect on some consumer protection cases, but we've got all of those. We've got data from all the state regulatory agencies dealing with employment, environment, consumer protection, financial matters, et cetera. We've also got selected local agencies, especially those local agencies that are investigating wage theft, which has become more common at the local level. And then we've got private litigation coverage. Now, we don't try to document every lawsuit brought against a company, but we do try to document all the significant class action and multi-district lawsuits that are brought against the company and that result in a verdict or a settlement in which the company is paying out some money. We've got coverage for about a dozen different major categories of these cases, including wage and hour cases, environmental cases like the PFAS cases, product liability, privacy, price fixing, etc. We link as many of the individual entities that we find in the data that we collect to a universe of over 3,000 parent companies. And these include publicly traded parents, privately held ones, private equity firms, because we treat their portfolio companies as subsidiaries if they own 50%, more than 50%, and also large nonprofits. So that's the US violation tracker. Now, just about a year ago, we introduced Violation Tracker Global, which is structured very much like the US version, except that it's focused only on large companies, about 2,000 companies, particularly multinational companies. And we've got data to the extent that it's available from more than 60 different countries. That data goes back to 2010. So that's a very, one more thing is that here's a slide where we show you, in addition to the individual entries, where we give you the source of the data, we have pages where we list all of the agencies and the online data sources that we use to derive the information. And here's the section we have on Australia, which has particularly good disclosure. And you can see that we've got a couple of dozen different agencies that we collect data from. So that's the very quick tour of Violation Tracker and Violation Tracker Global. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about it. Here's my email here. It's also on the homepage of the different websites. So I'll leave it at there, and I'll be happy to answer any immediate questions during the Q&A. So back to you, Arlene.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm going to turn it over now to Nadine to talk about her a big project that she did recently.
Hi, everyone. So Underage and Unprotected was a 3-year investigation in collaboration with the Public's Radio, the Rhode Island NPR station, and PBS Frontline. And we essentially spent this time investigating migrant teenagers from Central America who came to a town that none of us really know about. It's called New Bedford, Massachusetts, but it's actually the home of the largest valued seafood port in America. And migrant teenagers were going to New Bedford and working night shifts, filleting fish, killing crabs, packaging in freezers that were about 40 degrees at all times. We spoke to about 24 kids who said that they had worked underage overnight, and their typical day was working from 4 p.m. until sometimes 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes we heard as late as 6 in the morning, and then going to school and falling asleep in class, reeking of fish. And eventually many of them would drop out of school because the stress was just too much. The majority of these seafood processing facilities are private companies. And so one of the big challenges that we had, not only in dealing with a population that was very underground, was also with private companies who, because they're private, it's very difficult to obtain information about them. So you can go to the next slide, Phil. So that was one of our challenges. This is one of the kids that we spoke to. He worked at a seafood processing plant that processes seafood that eventually turns into dog and cat food. This is especially one of the more very tough places to work in because the scent of the factory is just unbearable. Like I went with him outside of the factory, and even from the outside, it makes you want to throw up a little bit. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. This is just a picture of one of the facilities in New Bedford, and this is from their company website, just to give you a general idea of where people were working. We had the opportunity to go to a seafood processing plant where two of our kids that we knew worked. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later, how we were able to get into that plant and how we got the CEO to allow us in. But just to give you a general idea of what we're talking about when we talk about kids working in these plants. Next slide, Phil, please. So the kids that we spoke to that we were able to get into the plant, this is from, this was Atlantic Red Crab Company. They kill and process crab for distribution to many major clients across the country. And yeah, we were able to get in, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that was really difficult, as I mentioned, was finding out information, especially about injuries, because we knew already from BLS data and from talking to sources that working in seafood processing was a very dangerous job for adults. So we wanted to understand what that meant, like what data is there to provide that information. So we obviously went to OSHA first. And when you go to OSHA, we have to always keep in mind that a complaint or a situation that happens within OSHA is either reported by the company or someone who works there. And when you're dealing with vulnerable populations, the majority of people, or a lot of the people who were working on the seafood processing floors were migrants. And so it's very unlikely that they were going to report any sort of issue. And so we got back a considerable amount of information from OSHA, but we thought that, we wanted to figure out more. And so what we ended up doing was gathering a list of all of the addresses of every seafood processing plant in Massachusetts, or in New Bedford, sorry, which was about 40 or so. And the way that we gathered that is we learned that every seafood processing plant had to file for a license with the Department of Marine Fisheries at the state level. So we got the list, and then we used those addresses to file a request with the New Bedford Police Department for all call logs from those addresses. And it came back with a list of all, with each address, all of the calls, and then in them it has categories of like if it was a false alarm from the alarm going off, or if someone fainted or some other random thing. And so we pulled the things that were interesting to us. And so there was like personal injury or unconscious fainting. And so we requested of those call logs all of the narratives, as they call them in New Bedford. It might be different in where you are. But you'll see in this slide on the red boxed area. So one of them that we received was from Mariner Seafood. And it says, caller states his employee cut her finger down to the bone and bleeding nonstop. Finger was cut on machine. Caller is not on the scene, et cetera, et cetera. And so from that, we were able to gauge kind of not real time, but seeing something on the ground, these injuries that were occurring on the ground. And so that really helped us gain insights into how bad injuries can get. Also, in these seafood processing facilities, there were 2 deaths associated with plants in New Bedford. Both of those workers worked for temp agencies, and so we're going to talk about that much later. But nearly all of the people who worked, including the kids who worked at seafood processing facilities, got their jobs through temp agencies. So we'll talk about that a little more, but that's just one of a few ways that we can talk about later into how we can look into private companies when information is so scarce on them. Next slide, please. So if you want to take a listen or read the story, we published everything in English and in Spanish. Also the radio story in English and Spanish, so you can go ahead and take a look. And yeah, we'll keep talking from from here.
Great. Thanks, Nadine.
Mhm.
Appreciate that. Um, Now we are just going to go into a conversation with our panelists. And please put your questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature. But I'll start with a question since we're talking about child labor. Jason and David, I know you both have done quite a bit around child labor. If you have any suggestions on how or tell me how you're covering it, what you're seeing. Obviously, we've seen a lot of increase in legislation, um, right? Loosening regulations on children in the workplace. Whoever wants to start.
Jason, you want to jump in first? Because I know you did a great
Yeah,
report on it. I can bounce off.
sure. Yeah, and I can speak from Florida's perspective, Florida specifically in that, we were one of those states that had one of those child labor bills filed. And for folks that aren't aware, there's been a push across the country, particularly in Republican-controlled state legislatures, to roll back child labor laws, essentially loosen or outright eliminate any kind of restrictions on the hours or types of jobs that minors can work. And so we had one of those bills pop up in Florida. I want to say 2024 was the first year. And so part of what we were able to do was this was building off some of the national reporting. David, probably a bunch of the work you had done. So it had been pretty well established in other states that this right-wing think tank, the Foundation for Government Accountability, had been orchestrating some of this stuff. So we went looking for those records, and we were ultimately able to land the emails that showed that they wrote this bill in the Florida legislature. And so that became a really sort of powerful narrative for folks pushing back against this, that this was essentially like Dick Uline's pet think tank wrote this law to put more kids to work, right? And so that actually played a big role, I think, in killing the bill in Florida last year. Even we've got, like a number of southern states, we've got a pretty right wing legislature, and even a number of like Republicans in the legislature down here were a little bit taken aback by that. What was interesting about that is the bill came back this year, and what we were ended up, I think there was kind of an assumption this was all FGA again, although it seems to have become kind of more of a right wing proving ground thing for politicians. What we found this year is it was the governor's office, Ron DeSantis' office, was really taking the lead on it this year in a way that he had not been a part of it last year, and so I think we're still trying to unpack exactly how the dynamics on that are shifting. Some of that feels like Ron DeSantis is trying to sort of like rebuild himself to try and run for president again. So some of this could be trying to like curry favor with some of those right wing groups and the donors behind them, like Dick Uline. But the issue is clearly not going away, and it didn't pass again in Florida this year, but mostly because there was for the first time in 5 years some pushback against Ron DeSantis here. So.
Yeah, Jason mentioned Dick Uline. Is a major GOP donor. Good friends with Donald Trump during the first inauguration. Sat, within spitting distance from the president. But I think this is a good opportunity to talk about tips of covering corporate misbehavior, because here he is, the head of this massive shipping and packaging company, quite a long distance away from Florida, and it's based in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, but by far is the largest known donor to the Foundation for Government Accountability. In fact, sending 17.9 million between 2014 and 2021. He, has not shown any donations from his foundation since 2021, but there's been an uptick in donations from donor advised funds, which are basically, operate as kind of like money laundering operations for the wealthy to hide their donations to, extremist groups like the Foundation for Government Accountability. So, what's his interest here exactly? I mean, all of these could be, avenues for stories. Here in Wisconsin, we have a divided government. We got, Democratic governor, Republican legislature because of how things have been gerrymandered here. But we also saw, child labor law, and it was, pretty extreme, because what it allowed for was for young people to also work in rural bars. So you could have, kids as young as like 15, It might have been as young as 14, I'm trying to recall. But serving alcohol till like 11 at night. I mean, it doesn't take, a rocket scientist to figure out, what could possibly go wrong in this type of situation, right? So trying to investigate and see, who's behind these bills and whatnot, can be, very effective in trying to expose, bad behavior.
Great. And no, I don't know if either of you can talk a little bit more about how you go into looking to see who's behind those bills. Jason, it sounds like you got some public records requests. Is that how you were able to trace it back to the author of that legislation? David, how are you tracking origins of these bills?
Yeah, yeah, I can speak of Florida. In Florida, we have pretty broad open records laws. We're having sort of like other places, we're having increasing trouble with the administration not fulfilling records requests in good faith. But generally speaking, we have access to a lot of stuff. So in that case, what we were able to do was we pulled emails and text messages, and the way we were able to identify who the Foundation for Government Accountability's lobbyists were, and we started requesting just essentially all communications between their lobbyists and a handful of key legislators. So that, like the bill sponsor, their aide, the committee chair, the first committee chair, who usually has a pretty big role in legislation, and that's how we landed on that stuff. And just for like the sake of tip, one thing to think about is I think a lot of folks going in looking for that would take the keyword approach. Instead of like picking two people to look all traffic for, would be looking for, child labor or like the bill number or a handful of key terms. If we had done that, we would have missed on everything. So much of this stuff now gets shared in a way that bill language, a lobbyist or the governor's office, when they're working a bill, will send bill language where it is just a scanned document, right? It's a hard copy document that they have scanned, and the file name is just whatever random name that the scanner assigned to the document, and they just email that with no context, right? There's no keyword search. The search function doesn't even work on the PDF itself, right? Because it's just an image at that point. And so it was only because we did between people without kind of limiting it in any other way other than the time frame and the people, we were able to land on that stuff. So it's important to sort of think through, you want to keep records requests like narrow enough that they can't charge an arm and a leg or drag them out for months, but you always want to be making sure you're not limiting yourself in some way that you might sort of just barely miss on what you know is there.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jason said. And building off of that, like, public officials are getting more savvy in the ways that they communicate, with lobbyists and right-wing groups and those looking to influence public policy. So, they're now using things like Signal, for example, an encrypted chat, or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, also online portals. So if you read, or you're doing background research on, particular representative or corporate lobbyist, and you find in other cases they've used like a portal or something like that to share information, Google Drive or something, be sure to, mention that stuff specifically. So that, if you are able to catch them, you could litigate in the future. In terms of looking for bills too, something that we do at CMD, right, is tr like looking at trends and seeing bills that pop up in multiple places, right? So there's oftentimes organizations that are behind these, what we call, bill mills. The most, notorious being the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. CMD maintains a wiki on this called ALEC Exposed. We have the largest model bill library from ALEC published there, along with we keep tabs on who are ALEC politicians, who the alumni are, who the corporate lobbyists are, corporate members, right-wing think tanks like Foundation for Government Accountability. So you can kind of go through there and search for bills if you think, or if you find, oh, this bill popped up here, but I also read that it's in Oklahoma or it's in Alaska or something, then that usually means there's some other group outside, coordinating this effort. Um, you know, they also might be, Foundation for Government Accountability is a member of an organization called the State Policy Network. So these are right-wing think tanks, many of them aligned with corporations in the states, to push model policies. So they could be origins of that. So you can look and see what, state think tank is or SPN group is in your state pushing this stuff. So these are some other avenues. We've also seen pro corporate bills, sorry, show up and Christian right bill mills, like the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, for example. So sometimes you can be surprised at what you can find. But if you're seeing the bills pop up in many places, it's likely being organized from some outside group and not coming organically from your, local state politicians.
Great and great points about how to pull records now. It's really changed in the ways you have to request records. I remember I was a reporter trying to get some records, and they would CC the attorney on everything so they could claim attorney-client privilege. Um, Nadine has spent a lot of her investigation looking at private companies, right? And how much more difficult it can be to find information on privately held companies. Phil, I think we haven't mentioned, not only has he been reporting on corporations since 1980 or so when he was at Fortune magazine, but he's also a private eye, a licensed private eye. So Phil, I wondered if you have some suggestions for how to dig into private companies.
Well, I should say that I'm an armchair private eye. I do all my investigating at the computer. But the first thing I would mention is that most of the government records, for example, that we have in Violation Tracker cover both private companies as well as publicly traded companies. So that distinction doesn't, really make a difference, when you're dealing with, records from EPA, OSHA, et cetera. So if you have a private company, definitely plug it into Violation Tracker and see what comes up, because we've got information on, probably a few 100,000 different entities. The other, as far as other kinds of information, I mean, obviously it's more limited than what you get for publicly traded companies, but the standard source is D&B, Dun and Bradstreet, where there's a limited amount of information, a limited amount of financial information about the principals in the company. It's not always completely reliable, but it's worth checking to see what they have. There's another database called Privco, which you could either subscribe to directly or perhaps get through a public library system, which I haven't used it a lot, but it seems to maybe be a little more reliable than D&B. So, definitely check that out. But a lot of the information you're going to get about privately held companies is going to be from human sources rather than from databases.
Well, that's a good segue into a question here for Nadine. Nadine, so much of your investigation, because it's a privately held company, because it's a lot of immigrants working there, relied on source development. Can you talk about the ways that you got people to open up to you and how you tried, including company officials, not just workers?
Sure. So when it came to workers, because, first they were minors and they were migrants and they weren't familiar with the culture and the language. So we had a lot of things working against us to be able to learn a little bit more about what these kids were going through and to kind of gain some sort of understanding if our hypothesis was in fact true. And so the way in which we found was really helpful to get people to trust you, and in particularly in vulnerable communities, is by connecting with people that they already trust. So what we did is I literally drew out on a paper like migrant teens in a circle, and then I put out all the possible places that they would need to interact with the world in New Bedford that maybe we could reach out to. So, for example, church, soccer stadium, where they went to play soccer in the park, the community advocacy groups, the primary medical clinic that served the migrant community, counselors, anyone that we could possibly think of. We wrote that out, and then attorneys was obviously a really big one. They're immigration attorneys. And we just went down the list and contacted every single one, and then created a relationship with those people. And so I think probably of the, couple dozen kids that we spoke to, nearly all of them were because we had a relationship with someone else that they already trusted. We did try a few times to kind of go at it without any trusted person supporting us. We went overnight to try. We waited until a night shift was over and waited for people to come out to try and talk to them. And that did not work out at all. They were terrified. It was in the middle of the night in a sketchy place and it just didn't work. And I would understand because I would do the same. So we realized, okay, that's just not going to work in this situation. When it comes to relationships with private companies. So I'll speak to one of the main companies that was mentioned in our story, Atlantic Red Crab. Um, I had been covering New Bedford for a while before I got the fellowship, and as I mentioned, the major industry there is seafood. And so during the pandemic, I did a story about essential workers working in seafood processing. And by doing that story, I had to connect with essentially it's a PR guy for he does like crisis management for seafood companies, not only in New Bedford, but in New York and New Jersey. And so I developed a relationship with him over the years, and he felt like he could trust me with information. I would call him just to kind of, you know, talk about nothing, even though I didn't need anything from him. And then when it came time to our investigation, we were looking into Atlantic red crab. We had a lot of information that showed that uh, kids that we had met had worked there. And I reached out to him a week before, we were trying to close everything up in our investigation. And I essentially asked him, like, we want a tour of the plant, and we want to speak to the CEO. And I was 100% like, he's going to say no, but then we'll write in our story that we asked, and then we'll say no comment, and then we did the best we could, and that's it. But because I had built that relationship with him over years, he gave us the opportunity. And from that, we were really able to get the perspective of the company owners. And we were able to see for ourselves what we had heard from kids and from adults for so long. So that was extremely helpful. So at the end of the day, it's building those relationships that is really important.
Thanks, Nadine. And that raises another important point too, which is source protection. And I know all three of you are actively working with people who are in sensitive places. And what are ways, I'll start with you, Nadine, on how you protect your sources and also and open it up to Jason and David too, as I know you're talking to people who work in government and sensitive spots. So and I think we're all familiar with the story of Reality Winner, who a very high profile case, but I think sometimes sources feel burned, right? Or exposed, and they're very vulnerable. Um,
Yeah. So this was one of the very hot topic discussions between our editors about what we were going to do to protect the identity of these kids. And on one end, like first in just the relationship with the kids themselves, um, we needed as much personal information about them as possible to prove and to fact check on our end. So there was a little bit of hesitancy about like, I need your birth certificate. Do you have it? If I can't get, who do I need to speak to? I need to get your pay stubs. I need your fake ID. I need a picture of I need all of these things from you. And that made them, in a lot of cases, feel, a little bit uncomfortable. And then it becomes the discussion of like, okay, we're gathering this for our own fact checking purposes, and this isn't going to be for publication. So when it came down to how are we going to identify the kids, the general rule of thumb, well, first I want to say that there was a major problem in trying to figure out whether or not we should name companies and whether or not we should name kids. And when it came to kids, many sources, adult sources who were connected with these kids, were hesitant to talk to us at all if we said that we were going to mention even part of their name, or even just the fact that they worked in seafood processing. Because what they felt was that what these kids are doing is the best that they can get And if we take that away from them, then there's nothing else for them. And so it came from a place of caring. And it's what allowed companies to have this situation go on for almost 2 decades. It has been going on for a really long time. So what we ended up deciding was that, according to Frontline's and the Public's Radio's kind of rules, we were not allowed to use pseudonyms. So what we decided was to use part of the kids' names. Usually most kids from Latin backgrounds have 2 first names and 2 last names. So we would pick part of that name that was the most common and use that one. If we had spoken to the kid once they had become a teenager, or, once they become an adult and they worked as a kid, then we could use their name because they were an adult if they said that they wanted to. If it was a child who still worked there, we wouldn't name them at all. We would just say a kid we spoke to who was 14 years old, and we wouldn't name the fish plant either. And so that's how we kind of got around making sure that we weren't going to endanger our sources who were, already giving so much information about their experiences. So, oh, and then can I mention something else? So around like maybe 5 months before we started gathering everything to put our story together, we found out that the Department of Labor was investigating 3 seafood processing plants, 3 of the ones that we were looking into, for child labor violations, amongst other things. And that really helped us out a lot because we were able to get from sources the documentation that showed that they were investigating that. So that provided more proof for us that we were comfortable to talk about this more, because that was one of the things with our lawyers, is that they were so anxious about talking about it without some government document providing our, proof that we knew something. And so that really helped give us some credence there. So.
David, Jason, you want to add anything on source protection?
Yeah, I'll say for like source more development, and I deal more with like like public policy reporting stuff. So I'm not necessarily talking to like kids that are like victims of like horrific labor practices and stuff like this. But in terms of like talking to like when you mentioned I worked at the Orlando Sentinel for a long time. I covered the Walt Disney Company for about 10 years, and when I was trying to sort of like build that up, one of the places that was really valuable was like reaching out to former Disney executives and finding people that would talk to me about the business, about that knew people themselves there. But one of the things I would always offer to them is I will never quote you in any way, shape, or form. And that helped get people comfortable knowing that at no point was I going to come back to them trying to use whatever they say or try and sort of pull them onto the record. I was just trying to learn from them. And what I'd found over time is, as you learn from folks, and eventually former Disney executives developed into like current Disney executives, that sort of thing. And what you found is like the intel you learned from those conversations, there was always other ways to kind of find it, right? Or like, if someone gave you something specific, there's usually some piece of paper somewhere that you could go find and sort of find on your own without having to like quote the source on anything about it. Or, if it was like analysis type stuff, there are like a billion talking heads out there that are happy to talk to reporters. You can interview those folks sort of knowing what you already know. And if they make a point that is right, then you sort of land on that and you can make the point that way. So just finding ways to make people comfortable talking to them without like expectation of any kind of transaction, right? Like they're not going to have to risk anything. That has been helpful to me. The other thing is, the other background in my case is tax policy is sort of where I came up. A lot of what I've done over the years is just reaching out to people that I know that work in the tax policy space, like committee staffers, like corporate tax attorneys, those sorts of things. Just reaching out to them saying, I don't have any specific asks. I just love to sort of get your thoughts on the stuff I've written and what you think I'm getting wrong or what you think I'm doing better. Like just kind of give them an opportunity to sort of take a conversation, whatever direction they want. Because I know I'm just going to learn from it, right? And so thinking about source development is kind of a long-term structural thing rather than, transactional stuff right in the moment when you need it, I think is really valuable maybe.
Before I turn it over to David for a question about project for the states, Jason, let me just uh, go a little further into what you said around tax policy, right? Because taxes are, for a lot of people, boring, complex, just don't even want to go there. How'd you get into covering tax policy, and why do you think it's obviously important enough to not only write a book about, but to really base a lot of your reporting career around it?
Oh man, this I actually can trace like an exact origin story to the moment this sickness started. So I've been doing I've been covering the Florida legislature down here for almost like 25 years, and so it was actually one of my very first sessions. I was sitting in a committee hearing, waiting to hear a bill I'd been assigned to cover. I don't even remember what the bill was this time, and a piece of tax legislation got taken up while I was waiting. And for anybody in this who's ever tried to read like a a tax bill, it may as well be like written in a foreign language. And if you don't like speak that foreign language, it may as well be written in like gibberish, right? It's just like it's impenetrable. But as I was just sort of sitting there and kind of half listening, I picked up enough from the debate to realize like this like gobbledygook I was looking at was actually it was a tax break for Valpak. I don't know if folks remember them. They're like the junk mail company that sends like coupons and blue envelopes and stuff. And it was essentially a way to give them, $300,000 a year for perpetuity, right? It was going right into the tax code. And I remember thinking to myself at that moment, like, if they'd put in the budget, here's $300,000 for Valpak, people would have flipped out. That never would have passed, right? But because they were doing it in this opaque way, nobody said anything, right? And that's sort of what got me thinking about like tax policy it is just the transfer of money. It is deciding who you're going to take money from and who you're going to give money to, right? And so it is when you think about it that way, it is so important, and it is like it is the ultimate root of all power government has, right? Everything it wants to do requires money, and so the decision of where you take it from is enormously consequential. And so much the folks that make their living, like getting tax breaks carved into law, rely on the fact that people are kind of intimidated by it, and so it's just so important that to like run towards this kind of thing rather than away from it, if that makes sense. Because once you start speaking the language, it becomes really easy. And so we found like electronic arts is writing itself incentives in Florida. It gets millions of dollars in Florida law in incentives from Florida every year under laws it wrote. We've got just this year, Philip Morris got the DeSantis administration to do a tax interpretation for it that's going to save it hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And when you start like connecting those dots, then you start like you can step back even further, like just in the Philip Morris case, came just about a month after Philip Morris gave Ron DeSantis $500,000, right? And you can really start to tie all that stuff together. But it just like there's like gold in those hills if you can just sort of like bring yourself to go up into them.
That
Great.
reminds me, like, when I first started at CMD, like about 10 years ago now, like, buried in the Wisconsin's budget, was the stripping of language from the university's, like, statement of purpose. They call it the Wisconsin idea, which included, and the phrases that they stripped from the budget were that the university should no longer like search for truth or strive to improve the human condition or extend its knowledge like beyond the boundaries of the campuses. And they got rid of getting rid of all that stuff. They put in meet the state's workforce needs. But this was buried in like thousands of pages of the budget, right? And we found it in there as we were going through it. So yeah, it just reminded me as Jason was talking about this. There's great, needles in the haystack in these budgets. And it can be time consuming and resource intensive, but you can find some great stories there.
I know we've got some questions building in the chat, but I do want to ask you, David, about Project 2025, which people are now familiar with, but Project 2025 for the states, right? So can you explain what's going on there and how reporters can, start looking into their stories, into
Right. Yeah. So like late last year, I mentioned earlier we're talking about the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which is this pay-to-play group that brings together corporate lobbyists, right-wing operatives, and state lawmakers a couple times a year to write and vote on model legislation to then take back to the states. Well, seeing how successful the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 was, ALEC decided to put together their own version for the states. And we got a hold of that. We had a source in the meeting in December go attend the presentation, and so we were able to get a recording for that. But within it were all of these, kind of wish list items for corporations. And there are a lot of corporate members. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I think there's all kinds of stories that could be had, in looking at ALEC and the types of models legislation. But I'll give you a few examples. ALEC over the years and including now gets a lot of support from the fossil fuel industry. So there was a bill that they're recommending in this document, the Electric Generation Facilities Closure and Reliability Act, which would prevent the shuttering of traditional power plants before new generation sources are online and ready to operate. There was a bill that classified both nuclear and natural gas as green energy. This would, anywhere that there was green energy within a state's codes or laws, it would then also include nuclear and natural gas, which is a huge policy shift, right? There was a lot of, promotion of deregulation because in 2024, the SCOTUS or the Supreme Court, overturned the Chevron decision. So there was, a bill that would cap, or reduce regulations by 35%. I don't even know how a state could possibly do this, but they had a bill, requiring that. And not only that, but to create an Office of Regulatory Management, which would enforce and manage the cap on regulatory requirements and put this like chief officer for regulations, appointed by the governor. Obviously these are things that like corporations would love to have. They hate regulations, right? They hate being bothered by government or having requirements by government. But ALEC does all kinds of bad things like bust unions, undermine public education, move voter suppression laws. And so many corporations are sending their money there. So why are corporations in your state or in your locality sending money to ALEC to do these types of things? I'll mention just earlier this week, the Salt Lake Tribune did a great piece, showing how the company Energy Solutions there is paying for state lawmakers' memberships. So directly paying for their memberships while it is working with the state of Utah to study whether to place a small nuclear reactor in the state. So they're hearing from ALEC how great, nuclear power is, or how they can promote these new, draft model bills in their states or get them passed, while they're getting paid to attend by, a nuclear company that has interests in the states. So all these make, really, really great stories, and avenues for exposing corporate bad behavior.
And just quickly, a question for you, Phil, because you are immersed in regulatory data. What are you seeing in the last few months, since late January, new administration, in terms of regulatory landscape?
Well, we're seeing a combination of kind of conventional deregulation and weakening of enforcement on the one hand, the way in which the EPA is basically abandoning its mission, the dismantling of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But at the same time, we're seeing kind of the weaponization of certain regulatory agencies to, be used to go after Trump's perceived enemies. Some of the stuff that the Federal Communications Commission is doing, or the Federal Trade Commission, very unusual behavior for a regulatory agency, and it's not, your grandfather's deregulation. It's something very different, and we're going to have to keep an eye on that.
There's a lot of potential for stories there. A question in the chat. Some countries, not the United States, require the disclosure of the beneficial owners of corporations. Has data from many of these countries helped us track down U.S. ownership? Phil, that might be a question for you, and can you explain what beneficial ownership is?
Yeah, a lot of the beneficial ownership data is more useful for kind of paper companies and companies that might be engaged in money laundering and other kinds of illegal activities. And it's true that some countries have made it easier to find that. There's been an effort in the U.S. There was an effort in the U.S. to do that, then it got blocked. For our purposes, our parent subsidiary matching, the depend on that kind of thing. We look for, information from, in SEC documents and other things of that sort.
Do offending companies share a common profile? And if so, how can we or do we use that information to intercept offenders before issues and injuries occur? So, like some kind of predictive modeling. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we're not in the enforcement business. We're documenting the enforcement. And I mean, basically, what we found is that there's an awful lot of repeat offenders. I mean, violation tracker essentially is an index of recidivism, because we're seeing the same companies breaking the rules over and over again. And that's why we have so many entries in the database.
A question about, does anyone in the state of Arkansas violate these food processing issues? I would say probably yes.
Tyson Foods is based in Arkansas, and they have a pretty notorious reputation.
Um, I do, let's see. Okay. Please put your questions in the chat or you also can raise your hand if you'd like to come off uh, mute and answer a question or ask a question. Um, and meanwhile, I will throw a question to all three of you, which is, what do you think reporters are missing? I feel like reporters give a lot of scrutiny to anything that government officials say. I don't always see that same scrutiny to company officials. What are you all seeing, and how can reporters improve the way they cover companies?
Go ahead, Nadine.
Okay. So I think one of the reasons why that might be the case is that companies are much harder to get to. They're not really owed communicating to the public as much as maybe a government entity might feel like they are. And so I think there's just a lack of access. But I think in terms of all the ways that we talked about today, like violation tracker is such an amazing tool. And I wish I would have known about it when we were doing this because it would have saved us like days worth of time. But I think really trying to think creatively about how to get the information from these companies and not just leave what they say at face value will really provide a lot. Like, I don't know how many stories I read where it's like, we reached out to this company, no comment, reached out to this company, no comment. So, of course, all that is left are the people who were willing to speak, which are sometimes not always government officials, sometimes, and so trying to, as we spoke about today, building those relationships, even when you don't need them, so that later on in the future you can bear the fruits of those labor.
Go ahead, David, and then Jason.
Sure. Couple things come to mind. First, is try to avoid, regurgitating corporate, PR blasts or press releases about new products or whatever without being critical or speaking to folks that might, have their eye on the industry, and be concerned about, potential dangers or harms or whatnot. We saw this a lot, unfortunately, during the pandemic, right? Around new technologies and whatnot that were released, or vaccines for that matter and whatnot. And the folks, readers need to know, what the opinions are of folks that actually study this stuff and are not just looking to make a buck or profit off of it, right? I would also add that a good place to look for stories on corporations that don't deserve or don't get as much attention as they deserve are pay to play groups. I mentioned a lot about ALEC. And I will say these exist on both sides of the aisle. So there is no left ALEC, but in other cases there are versions, right? So like we, at CMD spend a lot of, or pay a lot of attention to the Republican Attorneys General Association, which is a group that tries to influence state attorney generals, on the right. There's the Democratic Attorney Generals Association, which seeks to do the same thing on the left. There's groups like the State Financial Officers Foundation, which we've been tracking for a few years now and launched a project on, which is weaponize so-called woke capitalism and seeking to eliminate the consideration of ESG factors or DEI factors, right? And then there's a version of that, on the left as well. And these are pay-to-play groups. So the companies pay a lot of money to gain access to elected officials in order to influence what the work that they are supposed to be doing for their constituents or for the public. Trying to figure out what their agenda are, what they're doing at the meetings, develop sources within, try to go to the meetings if you can. Sometimes they will let you go, in particular if they don't know much about you. So all of this can result in really good stories. And again, this doesn't matter, if you have an interest, and the left, the right, the center. These pay-to-play groups exist across the board.
Yeah, and I'll just say real quickly on the first question of why there isn't as much of a tradition of covering businesses as aggressively as government. I think obviously like people think of government as the decision makers here and stuff, but like one of the things the way it clicked into place for me covering the Florida legislature was that focusing just on government felt increasingly like covering the giant face in front of me rather than the man behind the curtain, because we all know how much influence particularly the largest businesses have. We should cover them as aggressively and expecting as much accountability as we do with city councils and state legislatures and the like. And in terms of dealing with businesses and stuff, one thing that's always helpful for me to remember is they speak very differently depending on which audience they're talking to. So when they talk to public facing, like talk to reporters, or when they talk through their community relations departments, that is very different than when they talk to their investors, when they talk to policymakers, when they talk to their trade groups and stuff. And there are lots of ways, even when they won't talk to you, you can go find them talking in other ways. So, the obvious example is publicly traded companies and those investor calls. Make sure you listen to those. They are incredibly naked about what they are trying to accomplish and why they are doing things. The sort of monstrous stuff that they would never say to at a news conference of some kind, they will gloat about with Wall Street investors, right? But also find, there's going to be chambers of commerce. There's going to be niche trade groups that are producing all sorts of reports that you remember. Those are just brand laundering groups, right? They just exist, so you don't know which specific company, but those are the companies speaking. And those companies, you can find like really interesting things in the kinds of reports and documents those groups are producing. So just always be looking for different audiences that these businesses might be speaking to and trying as best you can to find out sort of how they're talking when they think no consumer is looking.
Thank you all so much. There are a couple other questions. We'll hang on and answer them, but recognizing that we're at the hour, I just want to thank everyone for coming before people hop off. We did get a couple other questions that we'll answer now if panelists don't mind. They've got a couple minutes to hang on, including a question for Nadine about and before I ask it, just one thing to note in Violation Tracker is the story of how regulators go choose what to enforce and what cases to go after, and the story of monetary penalties, right? So OSHA penalties tend to be very small compared to penalties against, for example, an investor, right? If you die on the job, one of the highest OSHA penalties would be around 16,000. If you defraud an investor, a bank can get charged billions of dollars. So there's a lot of uh, decisions that are made even at the within regulatory agencies. And so Nadine, there's a question for you about why you couldn't have gotten the injury reports in New Bedford from OSHA.
Sure. So it's not that we weren't able to get injury reports from OSHA. We did get, I think there were some like 40 or so, if I can remember correctly now. It's just that wasn't the entire story. So what is reported to OSHA is either reported by the employer or reported and also through like workers' comp, and also by the employee. And so it makes it complicated, one, because these workers work through temp agencies. So also we requested OSHA filings from the temp agencies as well. But in many cases, because the community that we were dealing with were, I mean, talking to a government agency is probably the last thing they would want to do. It made it really difficult. And so looking at the police calls gave us a better idea. It gave us a more expansive way to see the entire picture. So that's the answer.
Yeah,
I hope
I
that
would
answers the
just
question.
Yeah, I would just add to that because I think it's super important to like when you're doing that sort of thing to remember what exactly the rules are because whatever you're looking at, that's the limit of what you're seeing, right? They're not going to do anything more than the bare minimum. And just an example like that we have in Florida is the big theme parks are supposed to report injuries that happen on their rides and stuff like that. But like among other things, it's got to be on property. So like if they can get somebody just like walk outside of the parking lot, collapse and die just off property, that never shows up in these reports, right? So that kind of thing you have to be thinking about when you're looking at those data set. And that's why, thinking to go through 911 calls and dispatches was genius.
And I would mention one more thing to that point, Jason, is that to really know what you're looking at, I remember looking through the OSHA filings and seeing like category amputation. What would everyone think that that involved? An amputation. But then when you speak to the public records office and we're like, I want to know more about this amputation, they'd be like, oh, amputation doesn't mean amputation. It could mean like injury or something. You're like, oh my gosh, what does this even mean? So really, sometimes you think you know what you're talking about because it seems so obvious, but ask more questions just to make sure that, because I was following this thinking like somebody had their arm chopped off or something, and it ended up being like, I don't know, somebody hurt their leg or whatever. I'm like, oh my gosh. So yeah, just keep that in mind.
And a question here, when violators are exposed, do they remedy their actions with a monetary fine? Is anyone arrested? Does it ever affect the company's owners or investors? Um, uh,
Nadine, do you want to
Should, should I
respond?
speak? Oh, go. You speak.
Well, I mean, we only document cases in violation tracker in which the company has paid a penalty. So there's been, there's been a finding of fault or a settlement, and there's been a payment or at least a levy of a penalty. Sometimes the penalties don't get paid, which is a separate matter. Um, in terms of whether they change their practices, often it seems like they don't. They go on breaking the rules whenever they can. As to whether corporate executives ever get charged individually, that rarely happens, especially for larger companies. Sometimes, in particularly egregious cases, there will be cases brought against individual owners. I mean, there's some of the localities I mentioned that are prosecuting wage theft. Some of them are actually going after the individual owners of these small companies, like small construction companies, and charging them. I mean, they're taking wage theft literally as a crime and charging the owners of the companies with criminal offenses. But that's not being done with the Fortune 500 very much.
Yeah, again, the choices of what's a priority when there was all this smash and grab media frenzy around all the shoplifting. These not that shoplifting isn't wrong, but when you look at the companies that were reporting the CVS's and the Rite Aids, if you look at their regulatory record, they do wage theft in the millions of dollars, which is really allow means a worker doesn't can't pay their rent and get food, but they will be
And
hit.
we're not even talking about Medicare and Medicaid fraud that they're doing too, right?
Well, I want to th if anyone has anything that they just want to add quickly, while we still got a few people uh, here, or thank you everyone for coming. We'll send out a recording around this. If there were any questions, I saw there was a couple pretty specific ones in the chat, but feel free to reach out and can try to get you those questions answered directly from some of the panelists. And I'll send out the contact information of people on the panel if it's okay with them. So Thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next session.